In this demonstration, we'll be building a short quiz, a 2-question quiz, which will give us a result at the end of the process by adding the score of how many questions we answered correctly. I have 2 sets of multiple choice questions with buttons for each. So let me actually just do a test movie and demonstrate that now. And I've just got a little animated button to start the process. It's like my go button. So I click that and it takes me to the first question. What year was Facebook founded? And I have 3 buttons here for 3 possible answers. So when I click one, it's going to save which button I clicked into a variable, and I'll show you that in the code shortly. So the right answer here happens to be 2004. And as soon as I click, it not only records the value of the button I clicked into a variable and saves that for me, it advances me to the next question. So also the correct answer here is number 1, Mark Zuckerberg. And you can see here your score is 2 out of 2. And then I have a reset button that starts it all over again and basically clears the variables. So if I go back, I'll hit 2 wrong answers. And you can see I get a 0. And if I reset, I'll do 1 correct and 1 incorrect. And there's 1 out of 2. And again, when I reset, it sets the variable back to 0. That's calculating the total correct answers. So let me show you how we built that. I'm going to close it here. The basics on my main timeline. We've got an actions layer with 4 keyframes and action script for each one of those keyframes. Labels layer for my frame labels. Now this could have all been done technically on 4 frames, but I like to spread it out so I can read my frame labels. And you can see them here with the red flags, again aligned with the keyframes. The third layer is for my questions. If I move over to these frames here, you can see the questions that are listed here, and they're just text boxes. And I have 1 layer for the buttons. And you can see here 1 generic button. If I go to my library, it's just 1 button here. And I just gave them all unique instance names. So for example, on my first set of questions with the 3 answers, the first button is named Q1 wrong 1. So my naming convention is to start with which question and whether it was a correct or incorrect button click. The second one is called Q1 right. And the third one is called Q1 wrong 2. And these are the instance names for the buttons. So when I'm looking in my code view, I can very quickly recognize which button I'm referring to by the naming convention. So if I go over to the second set of questions here, the second question with the 3 buttons again for multiple choice answers. It's very similar, except these ones are Q2 right, Q2 wrong 1, and Q2 wrong 2. So again, you can see with the naming conventions, when you're looking at your code, it's very easy to recognize what it is if there's some solid logic in the naming. And that's up to you to kind of devise for your own purposes. But consistency is very important, and it will remove some of the possibility for creating errors. Now let's go and look at the third screen here, which is our results page. So we start here with the button. When we click the button, it sends the playhead to frame Q1. When we click any one of these 3 buttons, it registers which button was clicked in a variable and then advances the playhead to the next keyframe. And the same thing for these 3 buttons. Whichever one gets clicked, that value gets registered in yet another variable, and we hold those numbers, and then at the end we compare them and we check to see how many are correct and then add them in a third variable, and the value of that variable gets displayed inside of a dynamic text box, which I've named display total. And we need to have a name for it. It's like an instance name, and that's how we can refer to it in the code view. I also have a reset button here, which basically puts my playhead back to frame 1 and also changes the value of the variables back to 0. So let's look at the code now. So in my actions, frame 1, where we just have the big button, simply a stop command to hold our playhead paused on frame 1. And again, the red button is named red_button. And I just used my code snippets. And on this one, I had used action script, timeline navigation, click to go to frame, and stop. I'm not going to double click it, but had I double clicked it, it would have generated this code with placeholder code here. And then we type that in. We type in just the destination, and it's a frame label, so it goes inside of quote marks, and I named it Q1. So when I clicked on that red button, it advances me to the playhead, advances my playhead to Q1. There again we have 3 instance names, so let's look at the code view for frame 20. This is where I declared my 4 variables, so let me explain them one at a time. The syntax is var space and then you assign a name and then put a semicolon. So I have one called Q1 answer, and I've commented it here. It saves the number of which button was clicked in question 1. I have a very similar one called Q2 answer. Does exactly the same thing. Saves the number of which button was clicked in question 2. Then I have one for keeping score called total correct, and this is kind of the reset switch equals 0. So it starts off at 0 on frame 1. So when we return to frame 1, it does reset back to 0. And then finally, one referring to our dynamic text box. We actually do have to declare that as a variable as well. It's called total display. So we are currently on the first question in this keyframe. So here's the button that got clicked, Q1 wrong. I did go to my code snippets and I used event handlers mouse click event right here, and that created this function, and then I replaced the contents in between here with 2 things. One, assign the number 1 to the variable called Q1 answer. This is like a container, and this is what it contains. It contains the value. So if I click on the first button, the value of Q1 answer will be 1. If I click on the second button, which happens to be the right answer, the value of Q1 will equal 2. And again, this is like a jar holding this information. And if I click the third one, of course, it will put a 3 as the value of Q1 answer. And that's all saved inside of the memory to be exploited later. So the same thing for the Q2 answers, of course. So if I go to that page, Q2, again I have a stop command here, which I think is redundant at this point. I believe I say go to and stop. That's right. Let's go back to 20. Once the value has been assigned to the variable, we jump to the frame called Q2. I failed to mention that. And that's the same inside of each function. Okay, so then when we get to Q2, similar idea here. The button name, when clicked, will assign a value to the variable. Now the variables, let me go back here, only have to be declared once in the movie. They do become global. So you don't have to declare those in each keyframe. Once you do it, you don't have to do it again in each keyframe. So these will go into the Q2 answer variable. So the value of Q2, depending on which button is clicked, will either be 1, 2, or 3. Now because of the name of my buttons, I know quickly which one will be correct. Q2 right will be correct, so the first button is correct here. In this frame, the second button. So frame 1, question 1, the second button is correct. Question 2, the first button is correct. Let's go to our results page. Here I'm using a what's called a conditional statement. It's if this happens, do the following. It's very simple syntax. We have the if statement with a space, and inside of brackets we put the condition. So this double equal sign is like equals in math. It compares. It says if this is the same as the value of that, do the following. So I'll explain the logic again. If Q1 answer has a value of 2, which happens to be the correct answer, take my variable called total correct, and a singles equal mark means assign, not like math, but it means assign. It's assign whatever's on the right to whatever's on the left. So this means take total correct and assign the current value of total correct plus 1. So that's how you can add 1 to that variable. Same thing for the question 2 answer. If it equals 1, if 1 is the value of Q2 answer, take total correct and add 1 to it. So if it added 1 here and 1 here, it would be 2. And it would do the math for you basically. And then this is holding the value of your totals. So to share that with the audience, you need to put it in a text box. So we created a dynamic text box. We gave it an instance name of display total, and the syntax is name that text box with a dot text equals. And I could have put quote marks here and assigned a hard-coded string, if you will, or a hard-coded number. But I'm taking the value of this container, this variable called total correct, and displaying it in this text box. So it wouldn't display the word total correct, it would display the value of the word total correct, which is a variable. So the value of this variable will be displayed in this dynamic text box. And that's how it all works. One could have created different logic for this and ended up with the same result, but this was a way for us to try some conditional statements and work with variables and values and so on. So the reset button here, which is the last thing, is just a very simple go to and stop Q1. And when we go back to that screen, total correct gets reset back to 0. And that's how this was built. So I'll just play it for you one more time here. Test movie. All right. Simple button, go to and stop. Q1 answer. Click the right button. I'll click the correct button here. Incorrect button there, 1 out of 2. Reset. Correct button, and there's my total score. Okay, so that is how we can build a quiz. And I could have strung in 6 questions, and they would all be basically the same model, and it would calculate it all at the end just as well, no matter how many questions there are. So that again is using variables and conditional statements to create, in this case, a short quiz. And that's our lesson.